They were not just soldiers, they were voices of a nation silenced in a single dawn. At 4:38 a.m., when most families were still asleep, 60 of Burkina Faso's bravest sons were cut down in an ambush that came not with warning but with precision. Their coffins, draped in the red, green, and gold of the nation's flag, stood row after row under the unrelenting African sun. Mothers wept, fathers clenched their fists, and President Ibrahim Traoré stood still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He whispered only one truth: they were our voices, and someone tried to silence us. But here lies the haunting question: was this merely a tragic accident of war, or was it betrayal punishment for a leader who refused to kneel? Just days earlier, Western envoys had arrived in Ouagadougou offering medals, handshakes, and promises of strategic partnership. Traoré said no, no smiles, no awards, no deals. And then came the attack. Communications cut, drones blinded, 60 young men gone. Coincidence or consequence? For the people of Burkina Faso, mourning has always been part of their history. But this time, grief is not enough. This time, tears turn to fire and sorrow hardens into resolve. What happens when a nation chooses not just to bury its heroes, but to rise in their name? What happens when the death of 60 men becomes the spark for an entire continent's awakening? My friends, this story is not only about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa's long fight for dignity and whether the next generation will inherit submission or sovereignty. And tonight I ask you, whether you're watching from Atlanta, London, Lagos, or Nairobi, what side of history will you stand on? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. And stand with us as we uncover why this tragedy may have just rewritten Africa's future. The attack did not fall from the sky without warning. It came like a message written in fire. At exactly 4:38 a.m. in the remote eastern corridor near Dargo, Burkina Faso's soldiers were reinforcing a frontier station meant to protect villages from insurgent incursions. Suddenly, everything went dark. Within the first 2 minutes, communications were severed, drone feeds went offline, and not a single distress call broke through the silence. By the time reinforcements arrived, 60 men, fathers, brothers, sons were already gone. When the news reached Ouagadougou, the capital froze. By noon, the bodies had been recovered and wrapped in the national flag. Soldiers marched in silence through the streets, each coffin carried with reverence. Government buildings displayed the faces of the fallen. A long black banner unfurled on the steps of the National Assembly. They didn't die in vain. Schools across all 13 regions were closed for 3 days of national mourning. On public television, there were no music shows, no sports updates, only portraits of the 60 soldiers with their names, ages, and villages of birth. The youngest was just 19, the oldest 38. Many were fathers, all were sons of the land. Yet as the country mourned, whispers began to ripple through the air. Only 4 days earlier, President Ibrahim Traoré had received a delegation of American and European envoys. They had come with smiles, medals, and promises of partnership. To outsiders, it seemed routine. But inside Burkina Faso, people remembered the images: Traoré standing tall, rejecting the awards, refusing the cameras, saying simply, "We don't fight for applause, we fight for survival." And then, within the week, 60 soldiers were dead in a strike that bore the hallmarks of sabotage. In Bobo Dioulasso, elders gathered at the Grand Mosque for prayers. Outside, one man pointed at the radio broadcasting casualty numbers. "So this is the cost," he said. "This is the price we pay for standing straight." No one argued. At the University of Ouagadougou, students spray-painted the walls with a new slogan: "Our dignity has a price, and we are paying it." The press, too, began to change its tone. Le Faso Tribune, one of the nation's most read publications, carried a headline in bold letters: "Refuse the West," and they remind you who still holds the trigger. State television anchors stopped using phrases like insurgency and began speaking of strategic retaliation. Something deeper than grief was taking shape. Through it all, President Traoré said little. When briefed by his military council, he asked only one question: do we have satellite traces of foreign aircraft in the last 6 hours? The room fell silent. His commanders lowered their eyes. He gave no fiery speech, no public accusation. Instead, he walked past the pile of foreign condolence letters in his office and told his chief of protocol, Burkina Faso does not mourn with permission. That restraint, his silence, his refusal to point fingers did not calm the people. It fueled them. From villages in the north to markets in the south, the refrain was the same. If we cannot protect our own, what does sovereignty mean? The coffins of 60 soldiers had become more than symbols of loss. They had become a call to arms, not for vengeance, but for resolve. This was the turning point. A nation that had often been pushed to its knees was now asking a dangerous question. If refusing to kneel carries such a price, is the price worth paying again? And in that question lay the seeds of something bigger, a movement that would transform mourning into preparation, sorrow into strategy, and silence into strength. The morning had not even ended when the atmosphere inside the presidential compound shifted. One advisor later described it as controlled fire, a silence so sharp it felt like steel being forged. President Ibrahim Traoré did not lash out in anger. He did not issue dramatic accusations. Instead, he acted with precision. Within hours of the funerals, executive orders were drafted. Command chains were restructured. Key officers reassigned. The old system that left Burkina Faso vulnerable would never be allowed to fail again. The first visible sign came when Traoré gave a simple but resolute directive: build the wall. These were not just words. Logistics teams immediately began moving drone fabrication equipment toward the eastern frontier. Engineers were summoned to an abandoned facility outside Ouagadougou, once a dusty relic from the Sankara era. Under flickering lights, Traoré walked its halls, ran his hand along the cold steel beams, and told the waiting scientists and soldiers, "We build here. We build now. We build with our own." 3 days later, shipments of composite shells for unmanned aerial vehicles arrived. No imports, no foreign consultants, only Burkinabe minds and Burkinabe hands. This was not an act of vengeance, it was the architecture of deterrence. And with it, Traoré signed the most daring directive of his young presidency, the creation of a state-funded drone weapons program led entirely by local scientists and technicians. The blueprint was classified, but its ambition was unmistakable. Soon after, a new national initiative was unveiled, Operation Culpelgo. Its mandate was sweeping trained civilians in strategic defense, fortify borders with artificial intelligence, and establish decentralized tactical units across all 13 regions. Community halls became training centers. Teachers retrained as instructors. Farmers learned scouting. Hunters passed down terrain knowledge. Software students wrote algorithms for thermal drones. A new culture of readiness was being born. Across the country, posters of the 60 fallen soldiers remained on walls. But beside them, new images began to appear, diagrams of drones, training schedules, maps marked in red. The message was clear: Burkina Faso would not only mourn, it would prepare. Then came a development that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Just 48 hours after the attack, a gray, unmarked aircraft landed in Bobo Dioulasso. From it descended 11 men in black tactical uniforms, Russian special operations instructors. They came quietly, without ceremony, and with one purpose: to train. Unlike the West's envoys who offered awards and conditions, these men arrived on Traoré's terms. If Russia wants to support Africa, they will do it with dignity, or not at all, he told his generals. This was not dependency. This was strategic cooperation. By the third day, Russian instructors were conducting joint drills with Burkina Faso's elite units, urban counterstrikes, drone interception, border warfare. Training manuals were translated into French overnight, but the command structure remained fully under Burkinabe sovereignty. No foreign flags flew over domestic bases. No mercenary contracts were signed. It was cooperation calculated and respectful. The West noticed. Embassies in Ouagadougou issued carefully worded statements of concern. Think tanks in Paris and Washington rushed out memos titled "Russia's Advance in the Sahel." Media outlets shifted their tone, calling Traoré reckless and dangerous. But inside Burkina Faso, no one called it reckless. They called it necessary. For the people, this was the climax of transformation. In Banfora, a retired colonel looked over the new training curriculum and whispered to a reporter, "This is not revenge. This is memory turned into muscle." Within the first week, over 4,000 citizens registered for local defense education. In villages across the Sahel, the sound of gunfire drills mixed with the rhythms of drums. Artists painted murals of farmers holding rifles beside children with laptops. A new vision was taking root: defense as a national duty, not just a soldier's burden. And through it all, President Traoré remained calm, even solemn. He told Parliament in a closed-door session, "This is not reaction. This is recalibration." If we wait for permission to defend ourselves, we have already surrendered. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting. It was building. It was training. And it was preparing to ensure that never again would 60 sons be buried without a nation ready to rise in their name. The shock of the attack did not remain confined to military bases or government halls. It spilled into the everyday lives of Burkinabe citizens, reshaping the very fabric of society. What began as mourning soon became a nationwide transformation, where civilians and soldiers alike blurred into one single line of defense. Across the country, schools became training grounds. In Ouagadougou, students who once studied algebra now attended civic defense classes where maps of Africa replaced blackboards of equations. In Manga, a teacher opened the first session of civic warfare theory with a question that resonated deeply. This is Africa. The world calls it poor. But why is everyone trying to take from it? The room fell silent before a veteran stood up and replied, "Because we let them." Not anymore. In villages, traditional roles were repurposed. Hunters taught young people terrain reading. Carpenters converted workshops into training halls. Farmers became scouts, learning how to track suspicious movement near borders. Even grandmothers found ways to contribute sewing camouflage into ceremonial robes, reminding everyone that defense was not just the work of soldiers, but of an entire culture. The government, too, moved quickly. The Ministry of National Security was restructured, focusing not on sheer numbers, but on adaptability, surveillance, communications, code literacy. Each of the 13 regions received direct funding, bypassing slow bureaucracies, ensuring that resources reached local defense networks without delay. Red zones were digitally mapped, supply routes redrawn, and defense cells decentralized so no single strike could paralyze the nation again. To honor the fallen 60 freedom trees were planted across Burkina Faso, each one named after a soldier who died in the ambush. Beneath them, plaques read, "You fell so we may rise." For children, these were not just memorials, they became classrooms of memory. In Yako, a teenage girl handed President Traoré a handwritten poem. "We do not learn history to remember the pain. We learn it to name our enemies." He folded the paper gently and said, "Then name them well, and never forget to name yourselves first as guardians." Art and culture followed suit. Musicians in Batié turned protest lyrics into national hymns. Dancers in Tikere choreographed performances based on military formations. Griots, keepers of oral tradition, crafted verses that blended memory with defiance. When the nation bled, the cowards ran. But the brave picked up songs and turned them into spears. In this way, grief was no longer passive. It was mobilized into rhythm, art, and identity. Politically, the consequences were just as profound. Traoré's government no longer positioned itself as a caretaker of the state. It became the architect of a new doctrine of citizenship. Every Burkinabe was now expected to be part of defense, whether through intelligence, cultural resistance, or technological innovation. The line between civilian and combatant blurred not because of militarization in the old sense, but because survival had become a shared civic responsibility. This shift gave birth to something powerful: unity. In the past, Burkina Faso had been fractured by political disputes, ethnic rivalries, and regional inequalities. Now, under the shadow of 60 coffins, those divisions began to fade. A farmer in the north could see himself standing shoulder to shoulder with a student in the capital. An iron worker in Tenkodogo could recognize his role as vital as any general in Ouagadougou. In the end, the attack that sought to weaken the nation had instead bound it together more tightly than ever. The military was no longer the only shield. Every classroom, every village, every marketplace had become part of Burkina Faso's wall of resistance. This was not revenge. This was resilience turned into doctrine, memory turned into muscle, and sorrow turned into a civic revolution. While Burkina Faso was transforming its grief into discipline, the outside world was unsettled. In Washington and Paris, the official language was carefully chosen: concern, instability, Russian influence. But behind closed doors, the reaction was sharper. This small West African nation was rewriting rules the West had spent decades enforcing. From the American perspective, Traoré's silence after the attack was more dangerous than any speech he could have delivered. Instead of pleading for aid or demanding investigations at the United Nations, he quietly reorganized his defenses, expanded drone programs, and welcomed Russian instructors, but only on Burkina Faso's terms. For U.S. policymakers, this was a nightmare scenario: a leader who neither begged nor obeyed, but built. European media followed suit. Headlines shifted almost overnight. Yesterday, Traoré was called the daring young captain. Today, he was painted as reckless and destabilizing. Editorials in London warned of Sahelian extremism. Think tanks in Paris drafted memos about Russia's advance in Africa. Yet in Ouagadougou, few cared about Western labels. The nation was busy preparing, not posturing. Russia, on the other hand, seized the moment. By dispatching special operations instructors without preconditions, Moscow projected an image of pragmatic partnership. No contracts, no mercenary flags, no speeches, just cooperation. This was not the model of dependency Africa had seen before. It was framed as sovereignty with support, and in the battle of narratives that mattered. Meanwhile, Africa itself was watching closely. Mali and Niger quickly aligned with Burkina Faso, drafting a trilateral defense pact later known as the Sahelian Wall of Resistance. For the first time, three landlocked nations, often dismissed as weak, were presenting a united doctrine of defiance. No foreign bases, no outsourced security, no permission asked. This alliance rattled regional geopolitics more than any Western sanction could. And sanctions did come. Visa restrictions, frozen aid packages, canceled infrastructure deals, predictable tools from Washington and Brussels. But in Ouagadougou, the response was defiant. The Ministry of Finance quietly began fiscal delinking, reducing reliance on the CFA franc and preparing regional gold-backed reserves with allies. What the West saw as punishment, Traoré reframed as liberation. Better accused of nationalism than accused of submission, he reportedly told his ministers. The world stage split into two perceptions. In the West, Burkina Faso was portrayed as unstable, reckless, and leaning into extremism. But across much of Africa, and even among segments of the global South, it was seen as a nation breaking free, paying the heavy price of sovereignty but refusing to kneel. The death of 60 soldiers had become more than a national tragedy. In the eyes of the world, it had become a fault line, forcing Africa, America, and Europe to confront a new reality. Burkina Faso was no longer asking what it could be given. It was declaring what it would build. The attack that claimed 60 lives was meant to weaken Burkina Faso. Instead, it awakened something larger than the attackers could have imagined. Out of grief came resolve, out of silence came strategy, and out of tragedy came a movement that now stretches beyond Burkina Faso's borders. But here lies the warning. When a small nation dares to defend itself without asking permission, it does more than shake its enemies. It unsettles the world order. Sanctions will tighten. Propaganda will grow louder. Offers of help will return wrapped in conditions and traps. And yet, Burkina Faso has shown a different path to build, to train, to defend not with borrowed tools, but with its own hands. This is no longer just a Burkina story. It is an African story. In Mali, in Niger, in Ghana, in Kenya, young people are asking new questions. If they can rise, why can't we? If their leader refuses to kneel, why must ours bow? Ibrahim Traoré has become more than a president. To some, he is the spark of a continental reawakening, one that insists dignity is worth more than aid and sovereignty is worth more than applause. But the future is uncertain. Can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies? Are his reforms truly enough to protect his people, or will the cost grow too heavy? Should Africa unite behind him or prepare for someone else to continue what he has begun? These are not easy questions, but they are the questions that will define whether this moment becomes a ripple or a wave. And so I turn to you. Wherever you are watching, Atlanta or Accra, Baltimore or Bamako, this is your story too. Because what happens in Ouagadougou will not stay in Ouagadougou. If Burkina Faso succeeds, it will not only reclaim its own breath, it will remind the entire continent that Africa's future must be written by African hands. Share this video if you believe that Africa's awakening has already begun. Subscribe if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines. And let us know in the comments, what does real freedom look like to you? Should we build walls of resistance or bridges of unity? For 60 fallen soldiers, for millions still living, the answer cannot wait. Burkina Faso has chosen to rise. The question now is, will the world rise with it?